Over the past century, while Christian faith and practice have steadily eroded in North America and Europe, it has grown enormously in the global South. We learn about this growth through conversations with Dr. Timothy Wadkins, director of the Megachurch Project. First, we learn about the rise of spirit-filled Christianity in El Salvador, and then about the explosive growth of congregations of at least 15,000 in 10 different countries throughout the global South. We're very pleased to welcome to Kaleidoscope Dr. Tim Wadkins, who is Professor of Religious Studies and Theology at Canisius College. Welcome, Tim. Good to have you here and to talk about your recently published book, The Rise of Pentecostalism in Modern El Salvador, From the Blood of the Martyrs to the Baptism of the Spirit. Can you give us in a nutshell what the book is about?
The book is a history of the rise of a religious movement called Pentecostalism in El Salvador. El Salvador is a traditional Catholic country. Pentecostalism is very much a Protestant phenomena, and Catholicism has declined appreciably in El Salvador over the last half century, and this religious movement has risen dramatically. And so what this book is an historical account and an analysis of this movement and how it's impacting this country.
Well, we want to go into some depth about the book itself and the themes of the book. But first I want to ask you about you. You grew up in sunny California.
I did.
And you were Pentecostal.
I was. I was raised in an Assemblies of God family, which is one of the original Pentecostal denominations. Pentecostalism began in 1906 with a very large revival in Los Angeles, led by an African American named William Seymour. And it spread very quickly throughout the United States and the rest of the world. And I didn't know any other kind of Christian faith other than being Pentecostal. And for us, that meant that when we went to church, the worship was very loud. People's hands were raised in praise to God. People often spoke in tongues. People believed in faith healing. And I was a part of that until I was a sophomore in college.
Well, you left California for Chicago.
I did.
And then you went back to California for your PhD.
That's correct. I went to seminary in a suburb of Chicago at Trinity International Divinity School. And then I came back to Berkeley and did my PhD in a cooperative program between the Graduate Theological Union and University of California, Berkeley.
And how did you end up at Canisius College?
Well, I answered an ad in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I thought I was destined to teach at my alma mater, San Jose State. They had hired me on a series of one-year contracts, but because of the budget in the state university system, they froze any kind of hiring and they started to lay off people. So one day while perusing the Chronicle of Higher Ed, I saw an ad for Canisius College. I answered it, I came out, I interviewed, and I came to Buffalo.
How did you become involved in this project?
Throughout the course of my career at Canisius, I've been leading several different student seminars in the summers generally to countries in the Southern Hemisphere. So we've run programs in India, in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Tanzania, and I've probably spent more time with students in El Salvador than anywhere else. And so I ran about 5 3-week-long seminars with students. And when we were in these seminars, we were there to study Catholic themes, like the Civil War and the martyrs, Catholic martyrs that were killed during the Civil War. But we kept running into evangelical and Pentecostal pastors and churches, and I began to wonder if something was going on, if this was a movement that I needed to pay attention to. And that's what started my research into the project. And then I was lucky enough to get funding from the John Templeton Foundation that was administered through an organization at the University of Southern California. So they gave me money and I started going down to actually do research into the movement. And that's how it started and that's where the book came from.
So you really did research on the ground.
I did. I spent the better part of a year commuting back and forth to El Salvador. I would go down for 2 weeks, come back for a week, go down for 2 weeks. Collected a lot of frequent flyer miles that year.
Now, for a reminder to people, El Salvador is in Central America. It's bordered by Honduras and Guatemala. Population about 6,300,000 or 400,000.
That's correct.
Now, many of us are familiar with the civil wars in the 1980s. And we may also think of it being a very Roman Catholic country associated with the theology of liberation, the Christian-based communities, and of course the assassination of Archbishop Romano. But time has gone on. What has changed since the 1980s?
So in the 1980s, they fought a very, very bitter and very violent civil war. And to be very general about it, it pitted the government, who was interested, and the military, who were interested in preserving a very hierarchical, very tightly controlled social situation where the poor were oppressed. The poor had no land rights. And this had gone on for years and years and years. And so the poor began to organize. And one of the things that they developed as they organized is they developed a relationship with radical priests. Many of them were Jesuit priests. And these priests were embracing a new kind of theology that said that salvation was not just something that was in the hereafter, but salvation equated to liberation in the here and now, and that meant economic liberation. And so these priests, armed with this kind of theological thinking, began to get on the side of the poor, and they began to organize the poor into these little base communities that were Christian Bible studies, but at the same time they were very, very radical pockets of political rebellion. And it was these groups and other groups that organized that finally led to resistance, armed resistance against the government. And of course the government began to wage war in a very violent way against the poor, and the poor did not have the kind of arms that would be required to win a civil war. And all of it came to a head in 1980 when Archbishop Romero was saying Mass and he was killed.
What does all of this have to do with Pentecostalism in El Salvador?
Well, ironically, when I started taking students down to El Salvador, I teach at a Catholic college, I teach at a Jesuit college, and we were going down to El Salvador in kind of a pilgrimage to visit the grave of Oscar Romero, to visit the grave of Jesuit martyrs that were killed during the war. But we kept running into Pentecostals. And I started wondering just how big the movement of Pentecostals was. And so I teamed up with a polling agency at the University of Central America, and we did a national poll. And it was shocking what this poll revealed. It revealed that since 1980, Catholicism had dropped from a high of 88% of the population to something like 51%. And these evangelical Pentecostal groups had risen to 40% of the population. And because Pentecostals go to church, 3-4 times a week, this was becoming the dominant religious expression in El Salvador. And so I thought, somebody needs to look into this and figure out what's going on. And so that was the seed for the book.
Now, we're coming to the last couple minutes or a little over that, but I want to ask you that there are several very large Pentecostal congregations that typify what that is. They're different, but there are also these small congregations all over the place. Can you comment on each of the types quickly?
The two biggest churches in El Salvador,
huge,
and both of these churches happen to be among the top 5 largest churches in the world.
Wow.
One is Elim, the other one is Tabernaculo Baptista. Elim is a very classical, loudly worshiping Pentecostal church. They have something like 85 to 90,000 members. They organize the church according to cell groups that
Right.
meet every Saturday night. Tabernaculo Baptista is a Baptist church that has become somewhat Pentecostalized, although it's mild and moderate compared to what goes on at Elim. And it is directed by a very charismatic preacher. So it's very much a celebrity preacher that's in charge of that ministry, and Elim is very different than that. And then, you know, these churches are really only the tip of the iceberg, because there are hundreds upon hundreds of little congregations of 100 or so believers.
Churches of the poor.
Churches of the poor.
Now, but there's also a Pentecostal renewal of the Catholic Church there.
Yeah, the winds of the Spirit, I think, are blowing in the Catholic Church as well. And that has resulted in a development of Pentecostal-like behavior among Catholics. And they call it the renovation. And the renovation movement in the Salvadoran Catholic Church is the fastest growing part of the Catholic Church today. So while many parts of the Catholic Church are declining, the renovation movement is actually growing. And so it's what's holding the Catholic Church together in many ways right now.
Well, Tim, it's good to have you on, and I think we need to come back and talk in more depth what the implications of this are for the future of El Salvador, but also for world Christianity.
I'd be glad to do it.
Thank you for being with us and sharing about your book, The Rise of Pentecostalism in Modern El Salvador.